I think ringing that bell has more to do with making sure I know when to quit than probably you all knowing what time it is, but that's all right. Thank you for reading that, Jerry. I thought there were some good things in there for us to consider. I want to greet each one in Jesus' name this morning. Thank you for coming. So I'm not exactly sure what you're all expecting, and I'm not exactly sure either, but this morning and possibly next week may look a little bit different than some of the future lessons, primarily because if you notice in our book, and we're probably going to take a quick look at this, but hopefully you read it, the story there of the first baptism. It's there in the introduction of the lesson on page 2. When they got together on, it says there, a cold winter evening in Zurich, Switzerland. And while they were there, they ended up baptizing each other. And at that point, they became Anabaptist, is what they were called. We'll look at that a little bit. But in this lesson, lesson 1, it goes from there to Constantine. And then the next lesson starts out with kind of the Reformation. And I don't know if it's the teacher coming out of me or the more details than maybe necessary. How did we get from the early church to a time when there was a need for a Reformation? What happened? Did the Reformation just happen in a vacuum and there it was? Or were there things that proceeded up to that point to where there was a need for change? So, and if so, why did that happen, and what happened, and why all the persecution of the church, and then why the persecution of the Anabaptists and so forth. So I want to take some time this morning to go through that and kind of explain and work our way up to Constantine, and we'll close when the bell rings, and if I don't quite get finished up with this morning, we'll bump it into next week. Hopefully we'll get a little time for discussion this morning, we'll see. If not, we get down to about lesson 3, and I think it's going to be opened up more to where it's more probably interaction as we start actually looking at the Anabaptist movement a little bit more and looking at some of the scriptures pertaining to it. And again, I encourage you to read the scriptures, the background scriptures, because that helps us see what we're looking at in our lessons. So why did we need a Reformation anyway? And what caused the church to go from its beginnings to where that was actually needed? I think we'll start here with our slides. This right here is actually a picture of Dirk Willems, which is a very common picture of that kind of summarizes a lot of the Anabaptist movement. I had an interesting situation this winter. I was sitting in Panera Bread working. Yes, I work from there sometimes remotely. And I was sitting there working, and there was a fellow sitting over close to me. He was quite a bit younger than me. I would have said he was maybe in his 30s. And I heard a lady walk up to him and said, "Are you a pastor?" And they started visiting. And I needed to get up, and I walked past him at one point, and I just asked him a little bit about where he pastored and so forth, Muncie. But he grew up in this area. And he grew up Mennonite. And he said, "I still have this as a reminder." And he pulled up his arm, and he had this picture tattooed on his arm. So I'm sure Dirk would be proud of that. But anyway, we had a good little discussion there, and he talked about some of his background and his roots and where he's at today. But this picture summarizes a lot of the mentality of the Anabaptists, and I want to read something here by Joseph Lichte. He says, "Late in the winter of 1569, Dirk Willems of Holland was discovered as an Anabaptist, and a thief catcher came to arrest him at the village of Asperen. Running for his life, Dirk came to a body of water still coated with ice. After making his way in great peril, across it in great peril, he realized his pursuer had fallen into the freezing water. Turning back, Dirk ran to the stumbling man and dragged him safely to shore. The thief catcher wanted to release him, but the burgomaster, having appeared on the scene, reminded the man that he was under oath to deliver criminals to justice. Dirk was bound and off to prison, interrogated, tortured, and with an unsuccessful effort to make him recant. He was tried and found guilty of being rebaptized and was sentenced to being burned at the stake. On the day of his execution, a strong east wind blew the flames away from his upper body, so that the death was long delayed. The same wind carried his voice to the next town, where people heard him cry more than 70 times, "O my Lord, my God." The judge that was there, finally filled with sorrow and regret, wheeling his horse around so he could see him no more, ordered the executioner to dispatch the man with a quick death, which we don't know for sure if they did or not. But this verse that is in our books and that I think this is what they picked up as Anabaptists, the idea of following Christ at all cost. And the question is, are we willing to do the same? And would we be in their situation? So what is Anabaptism? The name means to rebaptize. And the first baptism there was January 21st, 1525. They did not consider it being rebaptized. They did not like the name Anabaptist. They said, we are not rebaptized. We have only been baptized once as a believer. The first was not a baptism. So it was a name given to them that they didn't agree with. I would say now the term Anabaptism refers more to a belief system, a way of how the Scripture is to be lived out and practiced. It's based on early Anabaptist beliefs and early church practices and beliefs as well. What it is not, it's not our means of salvation. We need to remember that. It is not how we're saved. Just being Anabaptist does not save someone. It's not only a heritage, though, and sometimes I hear today that the people leaving, it's just, well, we're leaving the Mennonite culture. It's just a cultural thing. It's a heritage, it's a culture, and that's where they leave it. Although it's a blessing to have an Anabaptist heritage, but it's more than just a heritage or just a culture. It's not the only way to heaven. We would understand that. Some of the things, Anabaptist distinctives, we would claim to be biblicist. In other words, if the Bible says it, we try to make application of it. Some of those things that they were noted for, and we should still be noted for, is separation. The church and state, the difference between that, and we'll talk about that in some later lessons. Much of the world today has come to agree with the Anabaptist on the separation of church and state. That's the way it is, and they didn't, and that's where it would have come from. Nonconformity to the world, simplicity, and if you read some of those early Anabaptist writings, you'll see that they would probably say we're not living simply enough in our culture, was probably what they would say. And salvation that produces a holy life. And we already looked at these. They were in the introduction, and I had asked Jerry to read that. So I do want to read something, though, that when we think about our Anabaptist beliefs and the idea of sometimes people get really touchy if you start to compare the differences between the Anabaptist and the Protestant evangelicals. This is a little booklet that, if you get a hold of it, would be good to get a hold of, is What is an Anabaptist? And it's written by Paul Emerson. Paul Emerson did not grow up Anabaptist. He was a minister and trained in Protestant evangelical circles and wrote this, and I just thought I would read something that he wrote here. These are not my words, these are his, and he's been around quite a bit. You might know him or know of him. This writer traveled for many years with the evangelicals, and his main reason for leaving the evangelical camp was the refusal of the evangelicals to require practice of biblical truth. Not unlike the times of the original Anabaptists, it was made clear that an evangelical may believe what he will, but to act on those beliefs to the point of practice was unacceptable. It is of grave concern to note that many present-day conservative Anabaptists are running pell-mell after the evangelicals. While it is true that many evangelicals do a good job at biblical exposition, it is likewise true that most of them do little by way of application. They may talk a lot about application, but in fact, they require nothing. And we could I could read on about that, but if you want more, and he talks more about what the Anabaptists are in there. So let's talk a little bit about the beginning of the church, because in our book it says back to the beginning, and I think we need to go back there to figure out where we got to where we were going. The day of Pentecost, of course, it was in Acts chapter 2, where they were gathered together in the upper room, or in a room there, and the Holy Spirit fell upon them. And what's interesting is you will see baptism being applied the day of Pentecost, and to the early church, a believer's baptism, the same as you saw that at the beginning of the Anabaptists when they became convicted as well that they needed to do that. Persecution helped the effort, and by that I mean the spread of the church. It helped that. The martyrdom of Stephen in Acts chapter 7, where it says, "Now they which were scattered abroad upon the persecution that arose about Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, preaching the word to none but to the Jews only." And if you look in Acts chapter 10, I believe it is, where Cornelius, his household is preached to, you see the gospel going to the Gentiles. You also see the Ethiopian eunuch, the gospel going down to Africa. And so the gospel is being spread through the book of Acts. And then with, of course, Paul and Barnabas going on their first missionary journey as they ministered to the Lord and fasted. This will be the church at Antioch. The Holy Ghost said, "Separate unto me Barnabas and Saul for the work whereunto I have called them." And when they had fasted and prayed, they laid their hands on them and sent them away. This right here is, and it's a map of the church, Christianized areas, the lighter color there by 325. And so you can see some of these areas where it was Christianized, and it's a little hard to see the two different colors of purple. I'm sorry, I can see it real good here, but some of the darker areas, which like I say, you can't hardly see it there. Yeah, that's a good idea. Why didn't I do that earlier? You might be able to see it a little bit better, but those are some of the areas that were Christianized by the time of Constantine. And then the overall, I would say the colors that you can see there are more the areas that were Christianized by the time of Constantine, and then that whole area by 600 was more so. And the gospel had spread to quite a few areas by the time of Constantine. So, from John to Constantine, what happened? And when I say John, because the Apostle John was considered to be the longest living of the apostles. He was kind of the end of that era. He would have been the only apostle, or the only one of the 12 that we know of that died a natural death, even though he had been persecuted. That's why he was on the Isle of Patmos. That's why there was, that's why where he was at when he wrote the book of Revelation. And so there were periods of persecution from John all the way through. There were also various heresies that came into the church, and a lot of those were based around Gnosticism. Even the writings of the New Testament, you will see the efforts to go against Gnosticism. When you see writings like from John talking about Christ being in the flesh and being actual taking on a body and so forth. These were things that the Gnostics did not believe, and Gnosticism affected the church for many years. And we'll even look at a little bit of that next week, how that affected guys like Augustine and so forth, and how that affected the church. But that was a real problem. So you had these heresies, you had Gnosticism especially, and there were others. We could list a whole bunch of them. But there were also a number of brilliant defenders of the faith who wrote a lot. And we have what we call the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. These were the writings up prior to the Council of Nicaea in 325. This book here contains some of them, and it's not real big text. And I didn't bring them all, but if you want to read the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and I've never read these books from front to back, for research only, but there are 10 of these. of the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. And so it gives us a good glimpse into what the early church believed prior to the Council of Nicaea. Now, you have writings after that, but they began to change because you have the influence of the Catholic doctrines and stuff start to really change that. The Anabaptists, some of the early Anabaptists were learned men, and they went back and looked at some of these early writings as well and tried to see what did the early church really believe, what did they practice. And a lot of these writings were written because of heresies that were out there. And so they were written in defense of pure doctrine and sound doctrine and what did the apostles believe and so forth. And there are some of these writers that were students of, like the Apostle John, or students of his students, and so there was good transmission of what they believed that was passed down. So you have that, and those things were being written from the time of John to Constantine. During that time, it was considered a free church, a believer's church. You became a member by choice. You weren't told you had to be a member, or you weren't just baptized because you were in the military or something like that. And so that was what was going on during that time, and there was a definite separation of church and state. From what I understand, up until the time of Constantine, I don't think, I want to give credit to Walter Beachy. I used his material quite a bit when I taught Anabaptist history in school. And he would have said that he knew of that he could find no one that could give him an actual case study of someone up until the time of Constantine who was a Christian and in the military. That was just, you just didn't. The church said, you're not in the military, and the military said, we don't want you if you're a Christian. It was just a complete separation. They weren't involved in government, they weren't involved in that. I think there was one instance maybe where someone had become a Christian, was in the military, and was going to be involved in the persecution of some Christians and said, I can't do it, threw down his armor and walked over with them and died with the Christians. I think it was about the only case that can be said to that. So why the persecution? Well, first of all, Jesus said, if the world hate you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world will love his own. But because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. Remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they have persecuted me, they will persecute you. If they have kept my saying, they will keep yours also. So Jesus warned that the church was going to go through a lot of persecution. That was just the way it was going to be. But let's take a look at some reasons. First of all, the Romans called the Christians atheists. Now, why would they call them atheist? That was a term for them. Well, they didn't have objects that they worshiped. The Romans, the pagans, would have temples with idols. They had all these kind of things set up that they would have worshiped all these things and worshiped emperors and so forth, and the Christians did not do that. They didn't have temples with their gods in them like the pagans did. They wouldn't attend the religious festivals. They would have a lot of these religious festivals, and the Christians wouldn't go. And so they were considered to be atheists, and they were not considered to be patriots of the Roman Empire and so forth. The Romans believed that their gods helped them in battle and the kingdom in general. And that's something to keep in mind. One of the reasons that they persecuted the Christians prior to Constantine was because they believed that their gods needed to be worshipped or they were going to lose their kingdom or they were going to lose battles. And so here were these Christians that refused to do it. So what do? You kill them or you persecute them so they will, because you got to win the battle. You got to keep the kingdom strong. And with the Christians there, this is going to tick off the gods, and so we've got to deal with this. And that was one of the reasons that they would have persecuted them. And the Christians even began to suffer under Nero. You remember the burning of Rome. Nero would have burned Rome and would have blamed it on the Christians. He would have set back. He actually kept his fire department, or the Praetorian Guard at that time, away from putting the fire out. It burned for days. Thousands of people died. He wanted to take what had been built as a city of marble and turn it into a city of gold. And so when it burned, then he blamed the Christians for it. He would have been the one, would have been responsible for the deaths of Paul and Peter. I think if I remember right, he maybe murdered his own mother and maybe some wives. I'm not sure who all, but he was. And then eventually, in his early 30s, I think Nero committed suicide. Other accusations, and that's not spelled right. The other, anyway, they claimed that they were immoral because they practiced the holy kiss. I think I had mentioned that last week. Some believe that Christians killed little boys and baked them into bread. That was actually an accusation toward Christians. Where did they get that from? Well, Jesus said, "This is my body. It's broken for you." And Jesus was the Son of God, they claimed, and was, but they would have said that. And so that was something that they accused them of. Called them stubborn and obstinate because they refused to offer sacrifices. So that's a little bit of what the Christians were facing. Now, we're going to look at something that leads us to a time where we move into this time of the church and state being one, and Constantine. And it's important to understand this whole Constantinian change. If we don't understand that, we won't understand why the church went from the early 300s to where it was at by the 1500s, and why there needed to be a reformation. The 3rd century was chaotic. There were at least 27 emperors during this time. And from the time of Marcus Aurelius, who would have been in from 161 to 180, things went awry. There was one general after another trying to assassinate the one before him, to be in power, to create power, and so forth. And during this time, you would have had persecution on and off throughout the kingdom toward the Christians. And sometimes that was more in localized areas. A particular magistrate in an area might persecute Christians because he's frustrated with them or upset with them or something. Other areas, the Christians were not being persecuted so much. And the church was growing during this time. But some of these emperors lasted 5 or 6 years, some 5 or 6 months, or maybe a few weeks until they were out. And there were other problems. There were some plagues that were going on during this period of time, this 3rd century. High inflation. And one of the reasons for that is one emperor would get in and he'd try to print more money. Ever hear of that happening? And the way they would do that, since they didn't print money, is they would just, of their coinage, they would take more silver out of the coinage and add more bronze into it. It still looked about the same, but it was becoming less valuable because there was less silver in it. And so that was going on. There was some famine, and yes, there was even climate change, according to the historians, during that time. Nothing new under the sun, right? And which probably helped with some of the famine. And some blamed it all on the Christians. Why were they getting the blame? Well, because they weren't worshiping the gods, the gods of antiquity. They weren't supporting the emperor and so forth. And so it's their fault. We've got famine, we got climate change, we got inflation, we got all these things. Why? Because of the Christians. Again, nothing new under the sun, right? And so they were being blamed for it. And you come to the time then of Diocletian. He took authority in 284. And he divided the power and created the tetrarchy, which is a rule of 4. So he kind of divided the power up so it wasn't just one person. He was trying very hard to stabilize the Roman Empire, to make it more stable. However, he would have believed, and these 4 were Diocletian, Maximian, Galerius, and Constantius, which was Constantine's father. Galerius believed strongly in the need of persecution of Christians, and the reason I say that is because notice later he actually is the one who gives an edict of toleration a little bit later, right before Constantine did. And we don't know exactly why. Possibly he recognized that Constantine was maybe being favorable to Christianity. We don't really know for sure why he changed that. But in 303, they declared an edict against the Christians. And there was a 20-year period of relative peace within the Roman Empire as far as politically. Things were kind of peaceful. For the Christians, it was a time of horrible persecution, pretty much empire-wide. These were not local persecutions. It was pretty much empire-wide. And if you can imagine being a Christian in that time and having had some maybe periods of relative peace and no persecution, on and off, whatever, and all of a sudden it's just like it's all the Christians' fault. Diocletian wanted to go back to the gods of the pagan gods, back to the gods of antiquity, and he felt like, along with the whole tetrarch, that if we do this, we can hold on to the Roman Empire. And there is a sense in which he did bring at least a little bit of stability to the Roman Empire for at least a period of time, for a period of 20 years or so. He also provided a means of succession of power. That had been gone, and it was just whichever general could stir up enough army to kill the next general or whatever and take power. And so after 20 years, he said, I'm going to give up my, a little bit like George Washington. After 2 terms, he said, I'm out. And so he had set that up. And so he abdicated his position as planned. I think it was after 20 years. Constantine comes to power. And we're going to talk just a little bit about how he came to power. So his father was in York in England and putting down some sort of a rebellion there. And while he was there, and Constantine had shown up, while he was there, he became ill and died. He died there in York. And the troops that were with his father immediately claimed that he was the new Augustus. He was the new emperor. Now remember, there's supposed to be 4 of them altogether. And so there begins to be this tension. But Constantine, he decided that, yes, he's going to take power. He's going to be the one. And in 311 then, there was this edict of Serdica, or the Edict of Toleration. And Galerius was actually the one who would have authored that, I believe. In 312, there was a battle of the Milvian Bridge. And I want to talk about that a little bit, what happened there. So, Constantine fights Maxentius at Rome. So he has come to power. He moves his way back toward Rome. And Maxentius is in Rome, and he's claiming to have power as well, and had actually killed the successor to one of the other of the tetrarchy. And so now he's got power, and he's in Rome. Rome had been sieged before. It had been under siege before in different times throughout history. And that's kind of what he thought he was going to do. He was just going to hole up in Rome. He had stored up food, he had stored up supplies, and everything was ready to go because he knew Constantine was coming. But then he gets this idea, and the Milvian Bridge, he destroys it enough that Constantine just couldn't come across the Tiber River and on into Rome. So he destroys it enough so he can't get across, and then decides, for some reason, that he's going to go out and fight Constantine out on the other side of the river. So he builds what was, I guess, sort of a pontoon bridge to get his army across the other side of the river. He builds this bridge, and he goes out to meet his cousin, Constantine, and they're going to have a battle. Maxentius actually had more, we would say today, more tanks, more artillery. He had more chariots. He had more men. He had a bigger army than what Constantine did. So the night before the battle, Constantine goes out actually to pray or to seek God. Now, history would tell us that Constantine had a couple of other so-called visions earlier to other gods or whatever. We don't know all the details, but he goes out, and somewhere in that setting, the sun was setting, or the sun was still up. In the sky, or in the blazing sun, he saw the sign of the cross or the Chi-Rho. Chi-Rho would have been like the first 2 letters of Christ or Christos, or the cross. He saw this sign in the sky and supposedly heard a voice, "In this sign conquer," or "In this sign be victorious. This is what you need to fight in." So Constantine goes back to his camp and says, basically, the Christ is also a God. He's also a God. And as some reports would have said, by morning they had painted the sign of the cross or the Chi-Rho on their shields and on their artillery, on their chariots and the whole works. And this is what they were going to do. They were going to go out and fight in the name of Christ. Well, the battle starts, and they didn't. The Maxentius didn't give himself enough room between the river and the battle area, and he starts getting pushed back to the river. And at some point, I don't know all the details, but at some point, they began to retreat back across the pontoon bridge. And different accounts give it a little bit differently, but at some point, Maxentius is tossed into the river, and he drowns in the river. And Constantine is victorious. And he fought in the name of who? Christ. Do you see now how the church and state suddenly become together? And so you had this great persecution. Diocletian really ramped up the persecution. And Constantine comes along and has victory. And now he is the emperor. Constantine goes into Rome, and like all non-resistant Christians would, they fish Maxentius' body out of the river, put his head on a pole, and parade it through the streets of Rome, and everybody starts giving Constantine honor and praise and so forth, and suddenly he's the new emperor. Basically, overnight, in a sense, you have the army becomes Christianized. And you have Constantine soon taking all of his military and so forth, and having priests or bishops, taking water and throwing it on them as they walk by. Baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. And suddenly they were being baptized and brought into the church. And suddenly you have this coming together of the church and the state, which sets up basically the whole progression between there and the beginning of the Reformation. Because you now no longer have a church that is doing its thing and the government doing its thing, they begin to come together. Now, he goes further than the Edict of Toleration, and he has an Edict of Milan in 313 that basically gives Christians a lot of rights. And under Diocletian, they were tearing down Christians' homes, any churches they had built, anything of that kind of nature. And now Constantine is beginning to actually help them build churches, like in Rome, the Peter's Cathedral, whatever it is, and those kind of things. He's beginning to. Now, he doesn't move completely away. He does not outlaw paganism, but he eventually would profess to be a Christian at some point, but actually was never baptized till he was on his deathbed, and we don't know exactly why. Constantine, I believe, would have had a sister that they believe was a Christian. His mother became a Christian much later after some of this. So there you have the beginning of the church and state. And I would agree with some that would say, and I think it's a warning to us right here in America, and if you look at some of the questions in your book, some would have said that what happened right here and the things that proceeded out of it plunged Europe into what is known as the Dark Ages, the darkest ages that Europe had been in a sense that if you just look at all the things that happened in Europe during those times, and that whole area, the whole Roman Empire area, that whole area there, Asia and Europe went into the Dark Ages. not only was it a dark ages for the political arena, but it was dark ages for the church. And what can we learn about that? What is it that we should learn when we start wanting to influence the government? So in your questions in your book, you'll notice what lessons can we learn looking back over church history? What assumptions should we avoid? And how is Christian nationalism today similar to and different from the shift that happened under Constantine? And next week, we're going to take a look at the Council of Nicaea, which is what I said, like the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and take a little bit of a look at how the church changed over that next 1,000 years and some of the things that came into the church. We've got a couple of minutes here. Does somebody have a question or a comment or something? I know I covered quite a bit of ground here, and we didn't get into a lot of theological things, and we may not get into a lot of theological things next week as much, but we will probably in lesson 3 we'll get into more of those doctrinal things and so forth. Someone have a question or something or a comment about this time period and the church and where it ended up?
I think our book kind of missed that, what you shared with this morning. And I appreciated that thought because, we're looking at the church, the new age in which we're living in today. Are we ready for a reformation? Where are we standing versus where these people were standing back then? Because of the influences that you brought out in the lesson we had this morning, I appreciate you bringing that history to us.
Yeah, I just felt it was kind of necessary to understand the dynamics behind it. And put yourself in their shoes as Christians and the bishops, because the bishops are going to meet, and they're going to meet with Constantine. We'll talk about that a little bit next week. But if you had been under a severe persecution for some years here, and all of a sudden you're free and the government wants to work with you, what would you do? Would you say no thank you? Or would you embrace it? You can kind of see the situation they were in and how they fell for it. And then power tends to take over as well. Anyone else have a thought or something on this? Yes, Dwayne.
You talked a little bit of what was gained and what was lost, but how do you bring that into America today where we have the freedom to live the Christian life? We're not persecuted like other countries.
Okay, good question. So maybe someone has something you want to share on that. So how do we bring in, so number 3 there says, what was gained and what was lost in Constantine's friendly stance toward the church? What were some things that were maybe gained, or what are some things that we could, are you saying like what can we learn from that in our situation today, being freedom to worship and so forth?
I would see one thing that was lost was their heavenly focus. One thing that was gained was peace on earth, but Jesus didn't really come to bring that necessarily. And so, as humans, we're not very good. If we're offered something that's gratifying here and now, that's comfortable here and now, we're not always very good at trading that for what's better in the future. And I would say that's the big thing that the church lost. And you can see it today. I see it in my own life as I'm offered these things. What choices do I make? And they definitely chose, and like you said, you can see why. I would have maybe chose the same thing. At that time, they didn't see maybe where it would lead to, but they traded power and earthly comfort, I guess, for essentially the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, very good. That's basically, they made that trade. And I would agree with you, they probably didn't know where it was going to lead to. But it was very soon after the church began to grow very cold, especially as you brought all the pagans in just by baptism, and suddenly they were Christian. And, yeah. Does that kind of help, Dwayne, a little bit? Like, I think that is true. In our culture, we have those freedoms, but we have to be very careful that we don't trade our freedoms and just kind of get settled into the system, or get so involved in the system that suddenly our focus is completely off. Yeah. Someone else
written because the man who was writing passed away. But it's interesting reading.
Okay.
Okay, so Irene said there's some books in the library talk about the time of Constantine and some interesting reading there. So if you're more interested in that, you could take a look at that. Okay, and I think if that's everything, I wasn't sure if I'd get through that this morning, but I tried to roll by quickly. Hopefully it wasn't too much in too short a time. Yeah, next week we're going to look a little bit more, Lord willing, at what that did to the church, that joining up, and look at some of the figures that greatly influenced the church during that time, and then leading up to the beginning of the Reformation. And then in lesson 3, we'll be looking more specifically at the actual Swiss brethren and that what happened there and how that all worked and some of those timelines. So, okay, thank you for your attention.